Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, The Invisible Injury, helping your leaders understand and address psychosocial risks. My name is Cassie Bolter and I'm the Events and Partnership Manager at Centres. Today's presenter is Shannon Roberts-Gibbs, a highly respected organisational psychologist and principal consultant with a focus on psychosocial safety at Centres. With over 18 years of experience in the industry, she has a deep understanding of the challenges that organisations face when it comes to creating a safer and more productive workplace. Just before we get underway, please note we're unable to hear you during the presentation, so if you have any questions, please enter them into the question box and Shannon will address them at the conclusion of the webinar. Thanks again for joining us. I'll now pass over to Shannon.
Thank you, Cassie. And good morning or afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians throughout Australia and recognise their connections to land, waters and community. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here with us today. We do this because we value Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, culture and knowledge. At Centres, our mission is to change the lives of individuals and organisations for the better every day. We do this by sharing our knowledge through training and coaching and combining what we know about the brain, psychology, leadership and team dynamics with what you know about your world of work. Our intent, and particularly today, is to offer different ways of thinking about health and safety and encouraging people to take control of their lives through the way they think and act. I have been lucky to be connected to Centres for over 15 years now, and the introduction of the psychosocial safety regulations in Australia last year is a welcome legislative change to support the work we've been doing with organisations and teams for over 20 years now. Today, I'm pleased to share with you our perspective on the psychosocial safety landscape and how you can empower your organisation and your leaders to promote a culture of positive safety. I have found that a lot of the webinars and articles in this space so far tend to focus on understanding the legislation and regulations with a real compliance focus, which can create a tick box mentality. As was the case with physical safety over almost a decade ago now, our belief is that by focusing at this level on hazards and risks and controls, you're essentially playing a game of whack-a-mole with your psychosocial safety approach, addressing issues reactively as they pop up, which can have a band-aid effect and drive the key issues underground. As we know, a failure to comply with any safety regulation or rule, be it physical or psychosocial, is really a byproduct of a deeper cultural issue. And so if you want to truly address psychosocial safety in your organisation in the long term, it's a matter of shifting mindsets and culture. To kick us off, it would be great to get an understanding from you all of how your business is currently responding to the new regulations. A poll is going to pop up on your screen and I invite you to respond with one of four options. It might be that you don't really know where to start and have only just started, and that's great. Welcome to the webinar. It might be that you have done or currently are in the process of doing the risk assessments, but are really not sure where to go from there. You might feel across the regulations, but are really not sure how to move this beyond a compliance activity. Or you might feel that your psychosocial safety risk management has always been pretty solid and you'll only need to make some minor tweaks to your strategy and to your processes. So I'll give you a minute to reflect and to put your answer in the poll. Okay, we'll have a look at the results as they start coming through. Oh, wow, this is really interesting. So it seems we've got a real mix in terms of people who are attending today. The highest response is that we're not quite sure how to move this beyond a compliance-based activity, which is really what we're hearing from our partners and clients that we're talking with. And then also quite a strong response rate to we've only just started and we're in the risk assessment process, but I'm not sure where to go from here. So that's great, and something that I think some value will be able to get from the webinar today. It does seem that with most of us in that compliance stage and responding to the regulations, it's not surprising. The regulations only came out late last year, and it has been an absolutely complex area to understand and address. I know myself, when I read through the code, if you've read through it, it does make your eyes bleed somewhat. And I think that organizations are also trying to work out who has responsibility and accountability for this area. Is it safety? Is it HR's responsibility? Is it risk or legal? Is it all of the above? And we know it takes time to create buy-in for this level of change and thinking. Yet come April 1st, which is only in 1 month, the regulations will become enforceable in many states. And so there is an urgency here to take action. So let's jump into understanding why this area has become so prominent and now the subject of legislative reform. Interestingly, as many of you might know, if you are health and safety leaders and practitioners, the Act has always made reference to both psychological and physical injuries and our obligations to eliminate or minimize these risks to our workforce. However, for a number of reasons, organizations have tended to focus more on physical safety until quite recently. And I think this is due to the often invisible or hidden nature of psychological and social risks and injuries, and the complexities in dealing with them. Psychological injuries differ from physical injuries in quite a significant number of ways, including their symptoms, the onset, diagnosis, treatment, recovery, and the impact and cost to the individual and to organization. Psychological injuries can be more subjective. They might not always have clear symptoms, which makes them harder to diagnose and treat. They can be caused by a wide range of factors, including, for example, work-related stress, workload, lack of supervisor support, and then personal circumstances or stressful life events can contribute and augment these issues and injuries. The recovery process for psychological injuries might be a lot longer and require more specialized treatment than a physical injury. So if we take the example of a physical injury like an ankle sprain versus the psychological injury of anxiety or an anxiety disorder from workplace factors, an ankle sprain is usually visible in terms of the symptoms and can be objectively measured and treated by a GP or a specialist, while a psychological injury like anxiety can be invisible in terms of the symptoms that the person may or may not display, and requires a more subjective diagnosis from essentially a range of professionals, be it a GP or a psychologist or a counsellor. An ankle sprain can be easier to recover from with a defined recovery period and return to work plan, and might not have long-lasting effects, while anxiety can be more chronic and may require ongoing treatment and support. And an ankle sprain may not have the same impact on a person's ability to work and their quality of life as something like an anxiety condition can. And so due to this often invisible or hidden nature of mental health conditions and the stigma surrounding them, and what you might find to be leaders' reluctance to intervene, it seems organizations have focused on physical risks and injuries at the expense of what is a significantly escalating issue in our communities and our workplaces. Indeed, psychological health conditions are now the fastest rising cause of disability in Australia. And sadly, suicide is the most common cause of death now for people aged 15 to 44. In terms of workplaces, claims for mental health workers' compensation are increasing 15 times faster than physical injury claims, with $1.8 billion paid out by compensation agencies back in 2018. PwC has reported that the cost of untreated mental health problems is predicted to rise to $18.6 billion by 2025 in only 2 years. Data out of WorkSafe Australia shows that a mental disorder claim has the highest time loss compared to other injuries, so almost double time loss, and payments are almost 4 times higher than those for all other claims. Importantly, mental health conditions actually increase the risk for accidents and physical injury, with the Black Dog Institute finding that untreated mental health conditions in the workplace can lead to a 30% reduction in work performance, a 70% increase in accidents, and a 600% increase in lost work days. The Australian Human Rights Commission found that almost half of employees have experienced conflict or other negative behaviours in the workplace, causing 1 in 5 people to take time off work due to stress. Even our own research at Centres through our safety climate survey data has found that 66% of people report that work has a neutral or a negative impact on their life outside of work. So that means that there's 2/3 of our workforce that are not finding work to be a positive experience on their mental health. The enormity of this mental health crisis, particularly exacerbated post-COVID, has accelerated the need for specific legislation and regulations that seek to stem this growing problem, particularly in light of the Respect at Work movement and findings regarding the pervasiveness of sexual harassment that continues in our workplaces. However, despite this obvious need, these new regulations will be seen by many workplaces as an obligation or even a burden or additional cost that they can't carry. However, the brutal fact is that the regulations are here. They are enforceable come 1 April in many states and jurisdictions. And so as the health and safety and HR leaders in our organisations, how do we assist in shifting mindsets to see these regulations as an opportunity to build positive workplace cultures, that is, as a currency to our companies rather than as a cost? I can imagine for many of you who work in the occupational health and safety and HR space, you might have been experiencing pushback and objections from your leaders at all levels to the requirements of the new regulations, despite them being law, and might find yourself being asked to or needing to make the business case for why your organisation should buy in and invest. So, not that it is necessarily our responsibility, but to help our case, I've created here a summary of the key reasons why investing in psychosocial safety management, more so than just from a compliance exercise, will actually create a range of positive outcomes for your organisation. So for organisations that are focused on dollars, calculating the true cost of psychological injury is a good place to start and can be quite a shocking exercise. So this is done through combining the direct costs of absenteeism due to mental health issues with the cost of the compensation claims and legal fees that you're paying out related to mental health issues, and then multiply this number by 1.5 to 3. And that multiplier is recommended by Safe Work Australia to include the indirect costs for mental health issues in the workplace, such as lost productivity, the hiring and training you have to do of replacement workers, and reduce morale in the workforce. But moving from a mindset of cost to return, investing in psychosocial risk management has actually been found to lead to a return of 2.3 to 5.8, which means that for every dollar your organisation invests in psychosocial risk management, in proactive wellbeing interventions, there's actually a return of $2.30 to $5.80 for every dollar invested. So this is directly to the bottom line. Not only is it the right thing to do, it's actually good business. And as we discussed, it's really important to highlight that poor psychosocial work environments and job stresses can increase the risk of physical injuries and accidents, as well as exacerbate the severity and duration of physical injury recovery. At an organisational level, the cost of turnover due to poor mental health is staggering. It's estimated to be $1.51 billion per year in Australia. It's been found that 72% of employees who rate their workplace as having poor or very poor psychosocial safety climate are looking for new jobs, compared to only 9% of employees who rate their workplace as having excellent psychosocial safety climate. And this impacts a company's brand in the market with both potential talent and with your customers. A study by Deloitte found that companies with a poor reputation for employee well-being and engagement were more likely to experience difficulties in attracting and retaining customers. So the business case for investing in effective psychosocial risk management is clear, but the biggest opportunity, more than saving costs and protecting your brand, is the impact on your culture. Safety, both physical and psychosocial, as many of us here today know, is a cultural binding agent. It creates a place where people want to work, where they feel included and free to bring their whole selves to work. And so by seeing the regulations as an opportunity to enable your organization rather than an exercise in compliance, you can drive cultural change that will make your leaders and teams more likely to engage effectively with your psychosocial safety systems and risk assessments. The amendment to the code to require organizations to consider psychological and social systems that influence how people experience work is a fundamental shift in how safety will be viewed and treated in Australian workplaces in the years to come. So I imagine most of you have become quite familiar with the code and the psychosocial risks that can create poor mental health outcomes for employees. To recap, psychosocial hazards are anything in the design or management of work that increases the risk of psychological harm. The code lists these 14 hazards that tend to relate to the demands of our role, like our workload, how much control and clarity we have over our jobs, to the organizational pressures or factors that exist in our workplaces, like how change is managed, how rewards and recognition is implemented, organizational justice, and then the social environment and the interpersonal relationships and behaviors we're exposed to the workplace in the form of bullying, harassment, and conflict. I find, and you might have found, that the terms hazard and risk are used interchangeably a lot when speaking about the regulations, but they are distinct in that psychosocial hazards are the potential sources of potential harm, things that could exist. Psychosocial risk is the probability that harm will occur as a result of exposure to these hazards. So for example, if exposed to the hazard of unreasonable workloads and excessive prolonged work hours, an individual's risk of experiencing fatigue, burnout, irritability, insomnia is increased, which left untreated could lead to physical symptoms like poor eating habits, headaches, muscle strain and injury, and eventually a psychological injury like depression or anxiety could result. So of these hazards, I'm really interested to understand from you all which ones your organization might be finding most daunting to address and put in place controls for. So is it high work demands, low levels of job control, lack of role clarity, inadequate leader support, poor workplace relationships, inappropriate or unreasonable behavior like bullying, harassment, violence, and conflict, or poor change management? I've listed just the most common hazards, or the ones that the organizations we work with tend to find more challenging to address. So I'll just give you a minute to pop your results. You can select more than one. Okay, we might see what results are popping up. Okay, so we can see, and this is not unsurprising, that high work demands is coming out of the poll as one of the most daunting to address. And this is very much the case in terms of the organizations that we talk to, and also, what is out there in the research as the most common psychosocial risk that employees report, particularly in environments that are customer facing or public facing, where the demands are dictated from external or variable factors. So for example, people that work in call centers, people that work in retail and customer service, people that work in emergency services and public safety, it can be very hard to put controls in place to manage that work demand, as external factors can influence it. It seems inadequate leader support and poor change management are then coming through as the second most highest. So in considering how we address these hazards, and avoid playing that game of whack-a-mole with them really requires a shift in how we view safety in our organizations. The regulations are really going to bring about a whole new frontier in how we define and manage safety by incorporating physical, psychological, and social aspects into a much more holistic view of health, safety, well-being, and inclusiveness in the workplace. At Census, we call this positive safety, moving safety beyond a narrow focus on the absence of harm to a proactive approach to promoting well-being and productivity in the workplace. Positive safety is characterized by a workplace culture that supports employees to be the best versions of themselves and to thrive, creating an environment where people can be physically, psychologically, and emotionally safe. So by incorporating these three elements to create that holistic view of workplace health, safety, and well-being, we can foster cultures of trust, collaboration, and inclusiveness, and create sustainable success and outcomes for the organization as a whole. Rather than seeing these new regulations as an additional burden on top of our existing health and safety systems, we have the opportunity to integrate them, to improve upon them, rather than feeling like we are adding more to them. Importantly, each element of safety is interrelated and supports each other, and a lack of safety in any one area can have a negative impact on a person's overall well-being and the resulting negative impacts we've discussed at an organizational level. The regulations require us to consider the person within a system and to take a holistic view of their health and safety across each element. As an organization, considering where to target your efforts here can require prioritization. And the regulations suggest that this process is informed by the results of your risk assessments and consultation with workers. And I'd like to invite you to share where your current interventions are targeted. So I'm very interested to know if you have started to progress down developing and implementing your psychosocial safety management. Are you targeting your processes, your policies, and your risk assessment processes? And you can select more than one. Are you looking at your work environment, the way jobs are designed and resourced? Are you looking at what capacity your team members have and their capability? Is your work focused on leadership's capacity to take on board these new regulations and their capability to have conversations and to intervene effectively? Or are you tackling all of the above? So put your answers in the poll, and I'll be very interested to see where we're taking our approaches. We will absolutely be sharing this presentation with attendees at the end. I've just seen that pop through in the chat. So you'll receive an email with a link to the presentation and also to be able to access a recording of the presentation if you do want to share it with anybody. I can also see some questions and comments coming through, which is great. We'll be jumping into those at the end, and we've definitely left a good amount of time to answer your questions. All right, well, it'll be great to see your results in terms of where intervention efforts are targeted. So unsurprisingly, with most of us in the early stages of implementing the regulations and undertaking the risk assessments, a lot of work is being done around processes and policies and risk assessments, and this is absolutely fundamental to implementing the regulations. It then does seem that leadership capability and capacity is the next focus, and I'm about to talk a lot about why that makes sense as a great place to start, and also great to see that 40% of attendees are focusing on all of the above. So thank you for sharing your results. So in terms of where your greatest bang for buck will come in influencing your psychosocial safety culture, you won't be surprised that executive and senior leadership support, sponsorship, and role modeling is the first and most essential step in building a positive safety climate and embedding that culture of positive safety within the organization. The critical nature of gaining executive support for your psychosocial safety system is called out in the international ISO guidelines on best practice psychosocial management, and they quote, The success of psychosocial risk management depends on commitment from all levels and functions of the organization, especially from top management. So if you're going to start somewhere, start with your leaders and your leaders at the top. This is our safety culture model at Centus. And you can see how the three elements of a person's safety exist within the system they interact with in terms of policies, procedures, training, and their physical and equipment and work environment. The most important part, the circle that surrounds all of this, you can see is leadership. Professor Amy Edmondson, probably the most well-known researcher in the area of psychological safety, sums it up nicely with this quote that I love. Not surprisingly, the most important influence on psychological safety is the nearest boss. And this is supported by our own research at Centus, which was conducted with almost 12,000 participants across 7 different industries. And we found that leadership had the strongest impact on well-being climate, more so than other areas of what you would consider traditional safety outcomes. So that is, the more positively a team member perceived their direct leader's safety leadership ability, the more positively they then rated the well-being climate of their organization. So this really reinforces that model of positive safety and how powerful each of the 3 elements of safety are in influencing each other. If you perceive your leader to have strong influence and care about your physical safety, it influences how you perceive they will care about your psychological well-being and health. The influence of leadership on the culture of safety and well-being is so strong that research finds it accounts for up to 50% of the variance in safety climate scores. That is, the way that a leader prioritizes and communicates about safety in the workplace, the level of trust employees have in leaders, and the extent to which leaders support employee well-being is the biggest determinant of an employee's mental health and well-being at work, more so than their work demands, job control, and social support. Those things absolutely have an impact, but a leader can make or break how those things are experienced. And this isn't a surprise. Leadership is key in every area of organizational culture, but absolutely in the case of psychosocial hazards and risks is the biggest driving force. If you're finding resistance from your leaders in rolling out psychosocial safety initiatives or about this topic and the impact it will have on their responsibilities in general, you are not alone. Whilst the regulations require organisations to start with systemic and organisational factors first and eliminate or reduce them, the onus on leaders to identify, intervene, and address these risks is really clear in the regulations. And that requires a big shift in mindset, capacity, and capability for our leaders. This will require extra time and investment in our leaders to be able to effectively roll out these regulations. I recently wrote an article about the common objections from leaders in taking ownership of psychosocial risk management and how you can address them. And the link to this article will be shared in the chat if you want to check it out. One of the most common objections that we find is around how. So once you get people bought into the why, which we've talked through, how you actually go about addressing these issues with people born from a fear or a reluctance to want to address such sensitive topics, it seems to be a common objection or concern. Research from the Black Dog Institute found that only 38% of employees believe that their leaders were committed to addressing mental health in the workplace. So giving leaders the tools to have these conversations is key, as improving psychosocial safety after addressing systemic issues really will happen one conversation at a time between leaders and teams. So on our website, in the resources section, you can actually find a free toolkit on how to have supportive conversations. It's a great starting point to give your leaders a framework on how to check in with team members that might be showing the signs of psychosocial risk. Really importantly, some of you might have heard about the landmark court case that happened in Victoria only last year of a solicitor who was working in the Specialist Sexual Offences Unit in the Victorian Office of Public Prosecutions. She was awarded almost $500,000 for psychiatric injuries that arose from her cumulative exposure to vicarious trauma in her work. Interestingly, when I dug into the case, when they were asked, the Department of Public Prosecutions, about their failure to ask Ms. Kozarov about her health and well-being, her manager said it would have not been appropriate to inquire into the private life of staff members, as that was confidential. And that is often the case and frame that we have. This was despite the court case proving that Ms. Kozarov displayed at least 9 evidence signs she was failing to cope with her allocated work and that her mental health was at risk. And therefore, they were found to be in breach of their obligations to check in with her and to provide a system of support and recovery. So the fact that this penalty of almost $500,000, which is very significant in relation to previous compensations for this type of injury, the fact that this was enforced prior to these regulations coming into effect and before it becoming enforceable this year, I think is a clear indication of the requirement for leaders to conduct welfare checks on employees displaying red flags at work, even in environments like the one that this individual worked in that have risks inherent in their workplace. The judges said that they needed to do almost everything in their power to reduce the risk of vicarious trauma that these solicitors were exposed to in the course of their work. So to assist with this, I've developed some questions that you and your leaders can utilize in conducting essentially a mini psychosocial risk assessment with team members. So it's really important for me to acknowledge how daunting and uncomfortable it can be for leaders to have these conversations. But now with the regulations in place, the requirement is there that they check in with team members who show signs of struggling mental health. And so as organizations, we need to provide leaders with the time and the training and the support to be able to do so. So these 6 simple questions aim to get to the bottom of this without a leader undertaking a quite formal, uncomfortable risk assessment of the 14 different psychosocial hazards. They also tap into the requirements of the regulations to take a trauma-informed approach, which is called out in understanding that a person's previous experience or exposure to these risks will have an impact and should inform how we respond if they are exposed to them again. E.g., if someone has experienced sexual harassment or sexual assault previously, the regulations indicate that we need to take a trauma-informed approach if that person is exposed again to sexual harassment in the workplace. So there is a level of sensitivity and extra support that is required. And of course, these questions tap into the interplay of personal factors outside of work. And that's a question that I think we're going to come to at the end of the conversation today about how do we manage that interplay of personal life events and personal mental health conditions that come into effect at work. Of course, enabling and empowering our leaders to have the capability, the time, the capacity to engage in these conversations is fundamental to creating a holistic and compliant psychosocial risk management system. From our experience, change here is created from the inside out by building upon the strengths of your existing culture and your existing safety systems and processes. So this circle here is what we call the Centis Way, and it actually closely mirrors the requirements of the regulations in terms of gathering data to identify your hazards, assessing the level of risk those hazards present, implementing control measures, and regularly reviewing the success of these measures. So start with your internal HR, safety, engagement data to give you a picture of how your employees experience your workplace. Consulting with workers is called out in the regulations as key here in terms of bringing this data to life. We find that internal benchmarking is often more important and relevant than external comparison. And so set targets and goals based on your own data and where you're at to track positive change as you drive your safety and wellbeing culture. As mentioned, don't only focus on the person within the system. The regs are really clear and strong here, And they call out the fact that we've often seen workplaces roll out something like resilience training to individuals or mental health first aid training to leaders without adequately and authentically assessing and addressing the systemic and cultural factors that impact their workers' well-being and their ability to actually engage those strategies. So we set people up for success by creating the right organizational enablers. Importantly, only commit to what you will actually do. Otherwise, we risk doing more harm than good. This was the case recently, you might have heard, with Marvel Stadium in Melbourne being called out for not providing adequate disability access at the Harry Styles concert last week, despite on their social media and their website claiming and promoting that they were disability inclusive. So an actor, Chloe Hayden, with autism, called them out for her inability to access the stadium sensory room, which only allowed 8 people at a concert of something like 50,000 people. She highlighted that disability lifts were broken, seating for disabled people was inadequate, and staff were unaware of the location of accessible bathrooms. And so she called out the fact that you can't publicly claim to be a disability inclusive stadium, and then the reality of that in terms of the training provided to your leaders and people and your facilities don't support that. And so Marvel Stadiums has now had to publicly apologise and have now committed to building additional and a secondary sensory room for their future events. The regulations and the case I talked about in Victoria, the judges said that organisations need to do almost everything, was the quote, almost everything in our power to eliminate and reduce risk. So not the bare minimum. So this can seem incredibly overwhelming in terms of where to start, but we eat an elephant one bite at a time. So start with your greatest identified risks. And as we discussed, start with your leaders. My understanding from the regulators and auditors who are starting to conduct investigations and audits is that they just want to see that organisations are taking action, that on the basis of the risk assessment process, that you are taking action to improve the safety and the environment for your workers. So use your existing mechanisms of communication and engagement so as to not put more on your people's plates. Integrate those mini psychosocial interventions into existing meetings or interactions. So for example, we have some clients who at their pre-starts, in addition to a safety share or a safety check-in, will get people to do a well-being check-in or a fatigue check-in for them to check in with where they're at from a psychological level, as well as a physical safety one. And lastly, don't set and forget. The regulations require us to continuously assess risk as soon as we see red flags and to respond flexibly. So conducting, for example, the people at work survey and your risk assessments once every year or once every 2 years will unlikely to be sufficient, as we need to respond as risk arises in our organisation. So in wrapping up, our goal is to shift the mindset from one of compliance to culture, from obligation to opportunity. And to do so today, we've covered a couple of things. How to build the business case for investing in psychosocial risk management with your senior leaders. How to shift that current definition of safety from the absence of physical harm to encompassing all 3 elements. How to overcome leaders' objections to taking ownership of psychosocial safety management and the critical nature of executive and senior leadership commitment and role modelling. The importance of creating capacity, so time, and building capability for leaders to check in with team members. A set of questions to check in about our team members' current experience of their mental health and wellbeing at work, and the importance of consulting with workers and getting their input to devise an effective strategy and implementation plan. Michael Leiter, a renowned professor of psychology in the area of burnout and psychosocial safety, perfectly summarises the challenge ahead of us all by saying, creating a psychologically safe workplace takes more than a policy or a program. It takes a culture of respect, trust, and accountability. Thank you so much for attending today. Before we turn over to you for questions, we have an upcoming masterclass that extends upon the information that I've shared today that I will be facilitating. and you can register your interest in. So let us know in the poll that pops up if you'd like to receive further information about the upcoming dates and the format of the masterclass. We're interested to hear if face-to-face is something people would like to engage in the regional cities, or whether online is a more accessible format. So it's a no obligation. You don't have to follow through and attend the masterclass, but if you'd like to receive some further information, just hit yes. Just give everyone a second to register that interest. Start putting your questions in the Q&A as well as we go through this. Also, if you'd like to be contacted by one of our team members to have the opportunity to book in a private and complimentary consult with myself to discuss your psychosocial strategy, there'll be a poll pop up. Someone will contact you from our team and we'll book that time in. It's private, it's confidential. We can chat about your current risk management strategy, your understanding of the regulations, and I can share insights and advice and recommendations. Absolutely no obligation, but pop in yes or no if you would like to be contacted for that. And so now over to you. We've got a good amount of time for some questions and discussion. I can see there's already been some in the chat I'll need to catch up on. So please submit your questions, and then Cassie's going to pop back soon with some for me to answer.
Thank you, Shannon. Yeah, I've had some questions come through in the chat, so I will just ask some of those. But if you can put them in the question and answer box, that'll be a little bit easier for us to go through. We've also had some questions as people registered for the event as well. So I will end that poll now. And first question that has come through was, how would you differentiate and manage employees genuinely under psychological risk from those who would now use this as a cover to threaten employers? That was a mouthful. Did you understand that, or do I need to repeat?
No, I understood that, and it's actually really, it's a question that, and a topic of discussion that I've been having a lot with leaders and organisations. It's also one that came through as a question before, as people registered for the event. And I absolutely understand, as someone who used to manage big teams and organisations, this concern. I think it is also one of our mindset around this, in terms of at its most basic level, we have an obligation to provide an environment free of harm and one of positive well-being and safety for our organisations. And so if individuals are presenting to us and sharing concerns around that, it is our obligation to assess that. And so my recommendation here would be about the amazing interaction between your OH&S and your HR teams to effectively have conversations with individuals to unpack what is going on for them at work that could be contributing to what it is that they are experiencing. The critical thing here, as is always the case in our safety and HR systems, is documentation. So documenting what people are expressing and sharing and getting that down, and asking those follow-up and probing questions. And that's actually what we're going to jump into in the masterclass, is once we ask some of those open exploratory questions, how do we then unpack that to tease out what might actually be happening in the workplace in terms of psychosocial risks that are influencing what is going on for an individual, teasing out versus what might be reflective of performance or motivational elements of the individual in the workplace. And so it's all of our traditional skills around active listening, reframing the conversation, identifying the individual's areas of control, challenging negative beliefs, and then providing the support or the adjustments that the individual might be seeking. And that is a collaborative process. So the regulations do say that employees also have an obligation to work with their employers to devise a strategy to manage and reduce the psychosocial risks that they're experiencing in the workplace. So not discounting the fact that it will be challenging, And there may be times where genuinely people are utilizing their knowledge of the regulations here, but an effective leadership performance management framework, effective HR systems and OH&S working together to address that. The regulation absolutely stipulates that performance management can occur alongside risk identification in the psychosocial space. I hope that answers your question.
Next question is, what is tricky is that a role could on its own create a stressful environment for one person and a challenge for another. What does a business make, how does a business make decisions with that in mind? Recruitment, assessment tools, things like that.
Yes, and this is, I think, the complexity of the regulations that people are grappling with, because when it related to physical safety, a lot of our controls could be universal. So, for example, an identified risk around height or trips or falls could be implemented with a control that existed almost for everybody, unless they had perhaps, say, a physical disability or a requirement to do something differently. However, as it relates to psychosocial risk, people will absolutely experience these hazards and risks differently. And that's a perfect example of how someone might find the elements of their role challenging and one person might find them overwhelming. I think, and I've seen this pop up in the chat, that recruitment is absolutely fundamental. We do absolutely need to be ensuring that we are matching people with the requisite skill and mindset and motivation and capability and potential with the reality of the role that we are putting them in. And so that can be done, you know, with all of your traditional ways of psychometric testing, job previews, assessment centers. And so, yes, it may mean that more investment and time needs to be put into recruitment here, but I think we can see that investment will create a return by bringing on board people, employees who will thrive in your environment and who will thrive in the role, as opposed to ones who will find the role not the right fit for their particular circumstances or experience. If, though, we're in a situation where we are presented with that exact example in terms of the people that we're managing, the regulations do say, number one, look at the systemic factors. So before we jump to the individual, are there things that we can do at a systemic level to create variability here? For example, job rotations, the ability for people to control or work flexibly with work or how they go about their work or their projects. So considering any things that could be increasing risk for everybody and eliminating them before we then jump and work with that specific individual around, again, really unpacking what is going on for them. So more than just a surface level of why are you finding this challenging? And they're saying the demands are too high, and then just assuming that the risk is excessive job demands, really unpacking that to understand much more comprehensively. It could be that, or it could be an interpersonal relationship they have with a colleague that is really causing them to not feel supported and therefore find their work to be more demanding. So by really unpacking and understanding what risk or risks are at play, we can then try and eliminate or minimize them. And for some individuals, that might mean adjustments. And so the regulations have always asked us to look at reasonable adjustments, and more so now the psychosocial risk in terms of saying, well, do you want to rotate? Is it possible for you to rotate out of this role for a period of time? Is there a way that you can go about your work in a different way? Is there any support or training or capability building we can do with you so that you are feeling more capable to manage the challenges of your role? Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, perfect. Next question is, what are the key elements of a psychological safety initiative and strategy?
Yes, great question. And I think there's two ways to answer this question. One is to think about the principles of an effective psychosocial strategy and how you go about it to really be compliant with the regulations. And so the number one is consult. So you would need to demonstrate evidence that you have spoken with your workforce to get their buy-in to the strategy. And this doesn't have to be seen as onerous. It doesn't have to be extensive months-long focus groups, but certainly forming some sort of guiding coalition of members within your team that want to contribute, who can then be the arms and legs to gather data, doing some survey work, doing some focus groups to get input from people to say, well, these are the risks that we have identified in our workplace. Because for many organizations, and the regulations acknowledge this, some risks cannot be reduced. E.g., if you are a healthcare worker working on the front line, you are going to be exposed to, at times, aggression and conflict from patients. And so what do you suggest as the people that face this risk day in and day out as controls or things that can be done? Things that will pop up will be things like more resources. Always is going to be one thing that comes up: training, support, backing by a manager, somewhere to access support and debrief, having a really bad day. So consultation is really critical and key. I think the other one, as I said, is try as much as possible, potentially by getting specialist help, but to integrate these psychosocial safety elements into your business strategy. Some of the organizations that we work with that are really advanced in this space, they don't even refer to words like physical safety or psychosocial safety anymore. They just refer to it as the way we work. So the way we work is this. So their values, their appropriate workplace behaviors, their safety and well-being values are all tied together into their culture of the way that we go about work. And so to make it seem not a burden for your leaders and for your people, but something that is just part of how we stay safe and how we look after each other, looking for opportunities that you can integrate the psychosocial risk assessment process, the identification of controls, your interventions into what you're already doing. Integration with your diversity, equity, and inclusion policy would also be a really great shout out, I think, and evidence of a best practice approach to a psychosocial safety strategy. And then obviously utilizing your data to regularly review how you're going and if you are making those positive shifts, and shifting your strategy and your process with that data would be key.
Thank you. The next question is, what are some ways that teams can build and grow psychological safety that is independent of leader-driven activity?
Yeah, great question, right? Because we shouldn't want it to always be on the leaders. And if you look through the regulations, there's a lot written about the importance of team building, team interaction, team socializing, particularly for now, many of us who are remotely dispersed or isolated or not co-located. And so one thing absolutely to create the opportunity for teams to be able to do this is to create the opportunity for them to collaborate and spend time together. And so there's absolutely a cost attached to that, but whether it is through bringing people physically together or really investing in your systems such that people can be spending more time together, so that they have an opportunity to chat, that you are building into their workload breaks and opportunities for engagement. That's number one, what's called out by the regulations as something that helps create that co-worker sense of support and psychological safety, that I could speak up and potentially reach out to a colleague about how I'm going and seek their support, which could help me minimize the risk of what I'm experiencing before it escalates into something like a work adjustment or a psychological injury claim. Other things would be about providing training and capability and support to teams in how to build psychological and social safety. So how to improve communication, how to have open conversations, how to provide feedback, and importantly, as called out in the regulations, how to deal with conflict. So conflict is really called out as an area which puts people at risk of psychological injury. And so providing teams with the abilities to effectively manage conflict themselves, to create an environment where you can constructively challenge without fear of your reputation or your job or your safety being threatened, is really important. And as much as we can, empowering the teams to be able to solve some of these problems themselves. So creating the sense that as a working unit, you are capable, you are responsible and contribute to this environment. And so we really empower and enable you to do, these things, to have this budget to do these morning teas, or to solve these level of problems without escalating it to the leader. By giving teams that trust, it will build their sense of psychological safety and trust and their ability to problem solve together.
Great. Next question is, what is the employer's responsibility if there are multifactorial issues that are not work-related?
This is a great question. And I knew something like this would be coming. So I have actually done a lot of research here in terms of how we deal it. So the brutal facts are now of the regulations that whatever the cause is, how a person presents now in the workplace, and be it with mental health concerns or psychological injury, the obligation to provide a safe work environment and to respond and provide support remains. So attempting to disentangle what is contributing to where is probably a moot exercise now. The important thing to do is to check off that you followed a number of processes. So the first one would be, I'll go back to the regulations, are there any risks in the environment or that this individual could be experiencing that are driven at an organizational leader level or co-worker level that you have not addressed? If you haven't, then that is absolutely the first starting point, eliminating and minimizing them. The second one is, have you been having informal, regular conversations with the individual about what is going on for them? We know in a performance management setting that we can't jump straight to performance management or straight necessarily, to time off work. We need to have demonstrated that we were checking in and having these conversations with an individual to understand what was going on for them. If we haven't, then we need to have that conversation, and the regulations are really suggesting that we have to have that in a way that emphasizes empathy. So empathy and empathic leadership seems to be one of the biggest call outs of the regulation, as opposed to, for example, the ISO guidelines, even more so in the Australian regulations, calls out that empathic, sensitive leadership is a requirement here. And so checking in with the individual and conducting your process, whether it is conversations to understand what's going on, performance management related to their attendance at work or their performance at work, or any adjustments that need to be made, all need to be conducted in a way that is supportive and sensitive. And so this is where I do think we'll see that organizations will need to engage the support of specialists. I saw this in the chat, but it does sort of augment the need to having people in the workplace that can jump in and can help if a leader is identifying that there's a lot of things going on for this individual and I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed in terms of how to deal with it. So who can jump in and support that leader to disentangle that? Then it would be absolutely about, if it is moving towards a performance management process, making sure that before that's jumped into, that reasonable adjustments are discussed and agreed upon with the individual. And as I said, that individual has an onus to contribute to that and to agree to that. You need to monitor that and see how that goes. And then only then do the regulations suggest you could jump into a performance management system. It also does call out the fact that if there is like a return to work and recovery plan alongside performance management process, those things can be managed at the same time and somewhat managed independently. So yes, it will be challenging for organizations, It has always been challenging to jump into issues around things that happen outside of work and the impact it has for people at work. But it's not impossible. And certainly with the right support to your leaders and to your HR teams, those conversations can be had. And importantly, as I said before, documentation is critical. And I just saw we're on time now, Cassie.
Yes, perfect. So that's all we've got time for today. So I'd like to thank you again, Shannon, and on behalf of Centis, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. We look forward to having you join us for our next webinar, Positive Safety, Shifting the Focus from Compliance to Culture, which is on Thursday, the 16th of March. Until then, everybody, stay safe.
Thank you, everyone. Please add me on LinkedIn and reach out if you have any questions or you'd like to chat further. And be well. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.